When I opened my mailbox that Tuesday morning and found the eviction notice addressed to me, my hands trembled, not from my arthritis, but from pure rage. My daughter-in-law, Sandra, had been standing right behind me with that sweet smile she always wore when she wanted something. "Oh, dear, Grandpa Frank," she said, her voice dripping with fake concern. "Look at that. You're 3 months behind on rent. Don't worry, though. Marcus and I have been talking, and we think it's time you moved into Sunset Valley Nursing Home. They have lovely facilities, and you won't have to worry about bills anymore." What she didn't know was that the modest apartment they thought I rented was actually a building I owned. What she didn't know was that the poor grandfather who collected cans for extra grocery money was worth more than their wildest dreams. What she didn't know was that I had been documenting their greed for 2 years, waiting for this exact moment. But what happened next would cost them everything they thought they were entitled to, and teach them the hardest lesson about respecting your elders. Before we continue, please subscribe to stay updated on our latest stories. If you believe families should be built on love, not greed, hit that like button. Now, let me tell you how 2 years of careful planning led to their complete downfall. My name is Frank Morrison. I'm 70 years old, and for the past 2 years, I've been living what most people would call a lie. Every morning, I wake up in my one-bedroom apartment on Maple Street, make instant coffee, and eat toast that I buy with coupons. I wear the same 3 shirts that I rotate throughout the week, drive a 15-year-old Honda Civic with a dented bumper, and spend my afternoons collecting aluminum cans to supplement what everyone believes is my meager Social Security check. To my son Marcus, my daughter-in-law Sandra, and my 2 grandsons, 16-year-old Jake and 14-year-old Tommy, I am exactly what I appear to be: a struggling elderly man living paycheck to paycheck, dependent on their occasional charity and too proud to ask for more help. But that Tuesday morning, as I stood holding that eviction notice while Sandra calculated how quickly they could liquidate my modest assets, I knew the performance was finally over. It was time for them to meet the real Frank Morrison. The truth is, I own 17 apartment buildings across 3 states, a commercial real estate portfolio worth $4.2 million, and enough liquid assets to live comfortably for several lifetimes. I've been living simply not out of necessity, but out of choice. A choice my late wife Margaret and I made 25 years ago after we watched money destroy too many families we cared about. Invisible wealth gives you the clearest view of people's true character, Margaret used to say, and God rest her soul, she was right. The decision to hide our wealth started when Marcus was in college. We'd noticed how differently his friends treated him when they found out his parents had money, how quickly genuine relationships turned transactional, how people started seeing dollar signs instead of a person. So Margaret and I made a pact. We would live modestly, invest wisely, and let our family love us for who we were, not what we had. For 20 years, it worked beautifully. Marcus grew up understanding the value of hard work. He married Sandra when they were both struggling graduate students, and they built what seemed like a genuine partnership based on mutual respect and shared dreams. The boys were born into a family that knew love didn't come from a bank account, but everything changed 2 years ago when Margaret passed away. I'll never forget the conversation that opened my eyes to who my family had really become. It was 3 days after Margaret's funeral, and I was sitting in my kitchen, still in the clothes I'd worn to the cemetery, when Marcus and Sandra showed up unannounced. "Dad," Marcus had said, settling into the chair where Margaret used to drink her morning coffee, "we need to talk about your situation." Sandra had pulled out a manila folder, the first of many folders they would bring to my apartment over the next 2 years. "Frank, we know this is difficult, but we're concerned about your finances. Living alone at your age, on a fixed income, it's just not sustainable. They'd done research, they explained. They knew what Social Security paid. They'd estimated my rent, my utilities, my medical expenses. According to their calculations, I should be struggling to make ends meet. They were right, of course. If I actually lived on what they thought I had, I would be drowning in debt. We want to help, Sandra had continued, but we need to be smart about this. Marcus just got promoted to senior manager at the accounting firm, and I'm finally established at the dental practice. We're in a position to make sure you're taken care of. The plan they laid out was simple. I would sell my apartment and move into a senior living facility. They would take over managing my finances to make sure I didn't fall behind on bills. And, in exchange for their guidance and support, they would become joint owners of my assets, just to make sure everything was handled properly when I was gone. "It's not about the money, Dad," Marcus had insisted when he saw the skepticism on my face. "It's about making sure you have dignity in your golden years." But I'd seen something flicker in Sandra's eyes when she mentioned the apartment. A quick calculation, a moment of greed that she thought I was too old and grief-stricken to notice. That night, I'd made a decision that would change everything. Instead of telling them the truth about my wealth, I decided to see exactly how far their concern would take them. Over the next 2 years, I played the role of the struggling grandfather to perfection. I let them believe their calculations were correct. I accepted their offers to help with groceries, their gifts of gas money, their occasional checks to help with unexpected expenses. I watched Sandra's eyes light up every time she thought about my apartment's location in what had become a gentrified neighborhood. I listened to Marcus explain why it would be better for everyone if they had power of attorney over my affairs, and, most importantly, I documented everything. Every conversation was recorded on the digital recorder I kept in my shirt pocket. Every financial transaction was photographed and filed. Every condescending comment about my age, my capabilities, or my confusion was preserved for posterity. Because Margaret had taught me another valuable lesson. The best way to deal with wolves is to let them think you're sheep until it's time to show your teeth. The signs of their true intentions had been subtle at first. Sandra would visit twice a week, always with suggestions for how I could better manage my limited resources. She'd bring real estate magazines featuring retirement communities, highlighting amenities I could afford if we were smart about liquidating your assets. Marcus would stop by on weekends with the boys, but the visits always included conversations about my long-term planning. How was I handling the stress of bills? Had I considered what would happen if I had a medical emergency? Wouldn't it be easier to let them take care of the complicated stuff? The boys, my grandsons, had started looking at me differently, too. Where they used to run to hug me when they visited, they now seemed embarrassed by my shabby clothes and obvious poverty. Jake had stopped inviting friends over when they visited. Tommy had asked his mother, loudly enough for me to hear, why Grandpa was so poor and smelly. Sandra's answer had been a masterpiece of manipulation disguised as compassion. "Grandpa lived in a different time, honey. He doesn't understand how to manage money in today's world. That's why Daddy and I need to help him make better decisions." 6 months ago, the pressure had intensified. Sandra had brought a lawyer to my apartment, just to explain some options, Frank, nothing binding. The lawyer, a young man in an expensive suit, had laid out several scenarios for managing my affairs more efficiently. "Mr. Morrison," he'd said, "at your age, it's common for families to consolidate resources for everyone's benefit. Your son and daughter-in-law are in a much better position to navigate complex financial decisions." When I'd asked what would happen to my independence, Sandra had taken my hand with that gentle touch she'd perfected. "Frank," Sweetheart, you'll have all the independence you want. We're not trying to control you. We're trying to protect you. But I'd seen the contracts they wanted me to sign. I'd read the fine print that would give them immediate access to all my accounts. I'd understood exactly what consolidating resources really meant. 3 months ago, they'd escalated to emotional manipulation. "Dad," Marcus had said during what became a 2-hour intervention in my living room, "we're not getting any younger either. Sandra and I have been talking about our own future, about the boys' college funds. If something happened to you tomorrow, do you realize how complicated it would be for us to settle your affairs?" Sandra had nodded sympathetically. "We love you so much, Frank." But love means making hard decisions. It means accepting help when it's offered. When I'd continued to resist, they'd tried a different approach: fear. "Frank," Sandra had said just last month, "I've been talking to some friends who work in elder care. Do you know how many seniors fall victim to scams every year? How many lose everything because they trusted the wrong person?" The irony had been suffocating. She was warning me about trusting the wrong people while systematically maneuvering to gain control of assets she thought I had. But the moment that sealed their fate, the moment I knew there was no going back, had happened 3 weeks ago during what I thought was just a regular family dinner. I'd been helping Tommy with his math homework while Sandra cleaned dishes in my tiny kitchen. Marcus was on his phone, as usual, and Jake was playing video games on the couch. It was a perfectly ordinary evening until I overheard Sandra on the phone with someone. "No, Mom, we haven't been able to convince him yet," she'd whispered, thinking I couldn't hear over Tommy's questions about fractions. "But Marcus thinks he's getting more forgetful. Last week he couldn't remember where he put his keys, and yesterday he asked me the same question twice." Both of those things were true, incidentally. I had misplaced my keys. They were in yesterday's pants pocket, and I had asked Sandra twice whether she'd heard from her sister, because her first answer had been so vague I thought she hadn't heard me. Normal things, the kind of small, everyday forgetfulness that happens to people of all ages. But Sandra was documenting them like symptoms of dementia. I know," she'd continued, "but if we can establish a pattern of cognitive decline, Marcus's lawyer says it would make the guardianship process much smoother. Frank would never agree to it voluntarily, but if a judge decides he can't make rational decisions about his finances—" I'd sat there, helping my grandson with his homework, while my daughter-in-law discussed having me declared mentally incompetent so she could steal money she thought I had. That night, after they'd gone home, I'd sat in Margaret's chair and made my final decision. I'd given them 2 years to show me who they really were. They'd exceeded my worst expectations. It was time for them to learn who they'd been underestimating. The eviction notice in my mailbox that Tuesday morning wasn't a surprise. It was a prop in the final act of a performance I'd been orchestrating for months. You see, I'd been forgetting to pay my rent for 3 months, building the exact scenario Sandra and Marcus needed to justify their intervention. I owned the building, of course. My property manager, David Chen, was an old friend who'd agreed to play along with what he called the most elaborate family intervention in real estate history. But Sandra didn't know that. As far as she was concerned, her plan was working perfectly. "Don't look so worried, Grandpa Frank," she'd said as I stared at the notice. "Marcus and I have already visited Sunset Valley. It's a beautiful facility. Much better than struggling to maintain this old place." She gestured around my apartment with the kind of pity reserved for people who've given up on life. The faded wallpaper, the second-hand furniture, the tiny kitchen with appliances that belonged in a museum, it all confirmed her narrative about my decline. "We've already put down a deposit," she'd continued. "The monthly fee is $3,200. but if we sell your apartment, the proceeds should cover about 18 months. After that, Medicaid will take over. 18 months. She'd calculated exactly how long my imaginary assets would last before I became a burden on the state. "What about my things?" I'd asked, letting my voice quiver just a little. "My pictures of Margaret? My books?" "Oh, Frank," Sandra's voice had been honey-sweet with condescension. "You can take personal items, of course, but most of this furniture is so old and worn. It would be better to start fresh." She'd been eyeing my bookshelf as she spoke, the same bookshelf where I kept the leather-bound first editions that were worth more than her car. Not that she knew that. "When would I have to move?" I'd asked. "The eviction notice gives you 30 days, but we think sooner is better." "Why prolong the stress? We could have you settled into Sunset Valley by this weekend." This weekend. They'd been planning this for months, waiting for the perfect crisis to swoop in and save me from my own incompetence. "I'll need to think about it," I'd said. Sandra's smile had tightened almost imperceptibly. "Frank, sweetheart, there's not much to think about. You're being evicted. You don't have other options." But I'd insisted on my right to consider the decision, and she'd finally agreed to give me until Thursday. 2 days to come to terms with reality. After she left, I'd sat in my kitchen, drinking real coffee from my secret stash and reviewing the files I'd been building for 2 years. Bank records showing every penny they'd thought they were giving me out of charity. Legal documents that would shock them into understanding who they'd been dealing with. And most importantly, recordings of every conversation that revealed their true motivations. Thursday was 2 days away. Thursday, Sandra and Marcus would return expecting to find a defeated old man ready to surrender his independence and his assets. Instead, they'd find out who Frank Morrison really was. I spent Wednesday morning at the offices of Hartman and Associates, the law firm that had been managing my affairs for the past 15 years. My attorney, Rebecca Hartman, was a sharp woman in her 50s who specialized in estate planning and elder law. She'd been expecting my visit. "Frank," she'd said as I settled into the leather chair across from her mahogany desk, "are you absolutely certain you want to go through with this? Once we reveal everything, there's no going back to your quiet life." I'd handed her the latest recordings from my conversations with Sandra and Marcus. The audio quality was crystal clear, their voices discussing guardianship proceedings, their calculations of my assets, their timeline for gaining control of my finances. "They're planning to have me declared incompetent, Rebecca. My own son thinks I'm a failing old man who needs to be managed like a child. It's time they learned the difference between acting helpless and actually being helpless." Rebecca had reviewed the documents I'd brought. 2 years' worth of evidence showing a pattern of financial manipulation disguised as family concern. Bank statements, photographs of every check they'd given me, transcripts of conversations where they'd discussed my supposed mental decline. "This is actually a textbook case of attempted elder financial abuse," she'd said. "The fact that you're not actually vulnerable makes their behavior even more legally problematic. They've been building a fraudulent case for guardianship based on financial circumstances they completely misunderstood." We'd spent 3 hours planning Thursday's revelation. Rebecca would be there as my legal representative with full documentation of my actual financial status. We'd also arranged for David Chen to be present with the real ownership papers for the building. And just to make sure everything was properly witnessed, I'd invited Mrs. Eleanor Walsh from apartment 3B, my neighbor who'd been watching this drama unfold with growing concern for my well-being. "Frank," Rebecca had asked as I prepared to leave, "what do you hope to accomplish with this confrontation? What's your endgame?" It was a fair question, I'd been asking myself the same thing for weeks. I want them to understand that respect isn't something you lose when you turn 70, I'd said. I want them to learn that love isn't measured in dollars. And I want them to realize that the grandfather they've been trying to manipulate is perfectly capable of managing his own affairs. I'd paused, thinking about Margaret and what she would have wanted. But mostly, Rebecca, I want to know if there's anything left of the son I raised and the family I thought I had. This revelation will either shock them into remembering who they used to be, or it will confirm that they're exactly who they've shown themselves to be. And if it's the latter, then at least I'll know where I stand, and I'll know how to plan my remaining years accordingly. That night I'd called both boys, Jake and Tommy, and asked them to come over Thursday afternoon. I'd told them I had something important to discuss with the whole family, something that would affect all of us. Jake had sounded bored, but agreed to come. Tommy had seemed more interested, asking if it was about the eviction notice Mom had mentioned. Something like that, I'd told him. Just make sure you're both here by 3 p.m. This is going to be a conversation you'll remember for the rest of your lives. Thursday morning, I'd woken up earlier than usual and made a real breakfast. Eggs Benedict and fresh coffee from the expensive beans I kept hidden in my bedroom closet. If this was going to be the last morning of my carefully constructed charade, I was going to enjoy it. At 2:45 p.m., I'd straightened my apartment, putting away the books I'd been reading and making sure my digital recorder was positioned perfectly to capture everything that was about to unfold. At 2:55 p.m., Rebecca had arrived with her briefcase full of legal documents and David Chen with his folder of property records. At exactly 3 p.m., Marcus, Sandra, Jake, and Tommy had knocked on my door, expecting to find a broken old man ready to surrender his independence. What they found instead was a 70-year-old man surrounded by lawyers and property managers sitting at a table covered with documents that would change everything they thought they knew about their lives. "Hello, family," I'd said as they filed into my small living room, their faces showing the first flickers of confusion. "Please, sit down. We have a lot to discuss, and I think you're going to find this conversation very educational." Sandra had immediately focused on the strangers in my apartment. "Frank, who are these people? What's going on here?" "Sandra, Marcus, boys," I'd said, savoring this moment I'd been building toward for 2 years. "I'd like you to meet Rebecca Hartman, my attorney, and David Chen, my property manager. They're here to help me clear up some misunderstandings about my situation." The silence that followed was broken only by the sound of Jake's video game, which he quickly turned off when he realized something important was happening. "Your property manager?" Marcus had asked, his accounting-trained mind immediately grasping the implications. Rebecca had opened her briefcase and laid the first document on my coffee table. "Mr. Morrison has asked me to provide his family with a complete and accurate picture of his financial circumstances. It seems there have been some misconceptions." I'd watched Sandra's face as she tried to process what was happening. The confident woman who'd been managing my supposed poverty for 2 years suddenly looked very uncertain. "Grandpa," Tommy had said, "are you in trouble? Is that why all these people are here?" "No, son," I'd replied, looking at him with all the love I felt for the innocent boy who'd been taught to see his grandfather as a burden. "I'm not in trouble. But some people in this room are about to learn some very surprising things about who they've been trying to help." Rebecca had placed the first bank statement on the table, just one of 17 accounts I maintained across different institutions. The number at the bottom had made Sandra gasp out loud. $847,000. "This is just one account," Rebecca had said calmly. Mr. Morrison maintains multiple investment portfolios and owns considerable real estate holdings across 3 states. David Chen had opened his folder and placed the building ownership documents next to the bank statement, including, he'd added, this building. Mr. Morrison isn't a tenant here. He's the landlord. The eviction notice was created at his request as part of what he calls a family education initiative. The room had gone completely silent. Even Jake had looked up from his phone, finally understanding that something monumental was happening. Marcus had stared at the documents as if they were written in a foreign language. "Dad, what is this? How do you have this much money?" And Sandra had looked at me with an expression I'll remember for the rest of my life. Not shock, not embarrassment, but calculation. Even in that moment of revelation, I could see her trying to figure out what this meant for her plans. "Well," I'd said, settling back in my chair and looking at each of their faces, "I think it's time I told you the story of who your grandfather really is. But first, let me ask you, what would you do if you discovered your family saw you as nothing more than a financial opportunity? Would you continue the charade, or would you reveal the truth? The confrontation is just beginning, and what happens next will determine whether this family can ever be repaired." The silence that followed my words was deafening. I watched as each member of my family processed what they were seeing. Bank statements showing millions, property deeds with my name as owner, legal documents that painted a picture completely opposite to everything they thought they knew about me. Marcus was the first to find his voice, though it came out as barely a whisper. "Dad, how long have you had this kind of money?" 28 years, I replied calmly, watching Sandra's face cycle through expressions of shock, confusion, and something that looked disturbingly like calculation. "Your mother and I built this wealth together, starting with a small investment property we bought when you were 12 years old." I gestured to Rebecca, who laid out a timeline of investments spanning nearly 3 decades. "We were very careful, very quiet about it. We never wanted money to change who we were or how people treated us." Tommy, bless his young heart, was staring at the papers with wide eyes. "Grandpa, does this mean you're rich?" "Very rich, son," I said gently. "Rich enough that I haven't needed your parents' help with groceries or gas money for quite some time." That statement hit Sandra like a physical blow. I could see her mentally calculating every dollar they'd given me over the past 2 years. Money I'd accepted not because I needed it, but because I wanted to see how far their charity would extend. "But the apartment," Marcus stammered, looking around at my modest furnishings. "The old clothes, the car—" "Props," David Chen interjected, opening another folder. "Mr. Morrison owns this entire building, plus 16 others across the tri-state area. The monthly rental income alone is more than most people's annual salaries." Sandra finally found her voice, though it was shaky. "Frank, I don't understand." "Why would you let us think? Why would you accept our help if you didn't need it?" It was the question I'd been waiting 2 years for her to ask. Because, Sandra, I needed to know who my family really was. I needed to understand whether you cared about Frank, the person, or Frank, the provider. I pulled out my digital recorder and placed it on the table next to the financial documents. "Would you like to hear some of the conversations you've had about me over the past 2 years? The discussions about my mental capacity? Your plans for guardianship proceedings?" The color drained from Sandra's face completely. Marcus looked like he might be sick. "I recorded everything," I continued, my voice steady despite the pain of what I was revealing. "Every conversation about my supposed decline, every plan to take control of my assets, Every calculation about how long my imaginary modest savings would last in a nursing home. Rebecca activated a small speaker and played back Sandra's voice from 3 weeks ago. If we can establish a pattern of cognitive decline, Marcus's lawyer says it would make the guardianship process much smoother. The room went dead silent except for the damning audio of my daughter-in-law discussing my mental competency like I was a problem to be solved rather than a person to be respected. Jake had stopped looking at his phone entirely now, his teenage mind grasping the magnitude of what was being revealed. "Mom," he said quietly, "did you really want to put Grandpa in a nursing home?" Sandra's mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. Marcus had buried his face in his hands. "The nursing home," I said, letting my voice carry the weight of my disappointment, "was never about my well-being. It was about liquidating what you thought were my assets and removing me as an obstacle to your financial plans." Rebecca placed another document on the table. "Mr. Morrison has also been documenting the financial assistance you've provided him over the past 2 years. Assistance that, given his actual financial status, could be construed as attempting to create a paper trail of dependency." "We were trying to help," Marcus said weakly, finally looking up. "Dad, we thought you were struggling. We thought you needed us." "You thought I needed your money," I corrected, "but you never asked if I needed your time, your company, your genuine concern for my happiness. Every visit was an assessment of my decline. Every conversation was a step toward taking control of my life." Tommy, who had been quietly studying the papers, suddenly looked up with the clarity that only children possess. "Grandpa, were you testing us? Like, to see if we loved you even if you were poor? Out of the mouths of babes." My youngest grandson had grasped in seconds what the adults in his family had failed to understand in years. "Yes, Tommy," I said, my voice softening as I looked at him. "That's exactly what I was doing." "And we failed, didn't we?" he asked with the devastating honesty only a 14-year-old could deliver. The question hung in the air like smoke, because the truth was, yes, they had failed spectacularly. Sandra seemed to recover some of her composure and immediately went into damage control mode. "Frank, I think there's been a huge misunderstanding here. Yes, we were concerned about your finances, but only because we love you. If we had known about your situation, everything would have been different." "Would it?" I asked. "Because from where I'm sitting, Sandra, it looks like your love was directly proportional to how much you thought you could get from me." Rebecca cleared her throat. "Mr. Morrison, would you like me to explain the legal implications of what we've documented?" I nodded, watching Sandra's face closely. "Attempting to gain guardianship over a competent adult through false pretenses is considered elder abuse under federal law," Rebecca began. "The recordings we have suggest a systematic effort to establish incompetency for financial gain. In some states, this carries criminal penalties." Marcus shot upright in his chair. "Criminal? Dad, we would never. We were trying to protect you." "From what?" I asked pointedly. "From making my own decisions about my own money? From living independently in my own building? From choosing how to spend my own wealth?" David Chen spoke up for the first time since the revelations began. "Mr. Morrison, shall I explain about the eviction notice?" "Please do, David." "The eviction notice your family received was created at Mr. Morrison's request as a test. He wanted to see how you would respond to what appeared to be a crisis in his housing situation. Would you offer genuine support, or would you see it as an opportunity to gain control of his assets?" Sandra was beginning to show signs of anger now, her shock giving way to indignation. "That's entrapment, Frank. You manipulated us." I gave you exactly what you expected to see, I replied. A vulnerable elderly man who needed help managing his affairs. Your response revealed everything I needed to know about your true motivations. Jake, who had been silent through most of this exchange, finally spoke up. Grandpa, I'm confused. If you have all this money, why did you live like this? He gestured around the modest apartment. It was a fair question, and one that deserved an honest answer. Jake, when your grandmother Margaret was alive, we learned something important about wealth. It changes how people treat you. Sometimes in good ways, sometimes in terrible ways. We decided we'd rather be loved for who we were than valued for what we had. I stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the neighborhood where I'd been playing poor for 2 years. We wanted your father to grow up understanding the value of hard work. We wanted you boys to appreciate that character matters more than bank accounts. But it backfired, Tommy observed with stunning accuracy, because when we thought you were poor, we stopped caring about you as much. Another devastating truth from a child's mouth. Marcus finally broke down. Dad, I'm so ashamed. I don't know what to say. You could start with the truth, I suggested. Were you really concerned about my well-being, or were you trying to position yourselves to inherit what you thought I had? The question seemed to break something in Marcus. Tears started flowing as he buried his face in his hands again. Both, he whispered. God help me, Dad. It was both. I was worried about you, but Sandra and I. We've been struggling financially. My promotion didn't come with as much of a raise as we expected, and Sandra's practice has been slow, and the boys' expenses keep growing. Sandra shot him a sharp look, clearly not wanting their financial situation exposed, but Marcus continued. We saw an opportunity to solve multiple problems at once. Help you get the care you needed while securing our own future. It seemed logical, responsible even. It seemed like theft, I corrected. Systematic, premeditated theft disguised as family concern. Rebecca pulled out another document. Mr. Morrison, would you like to address the financial assistance they've provided? I nodded. This was perhaps the most painful part of the entire revelation. Over the past 2 years, I began, you've given me approximately $3,800 in various forms of assistance. Grocery money, gas money, help with what you thought were unexpected expenses. Marcus looked up hopefully, as if this proved their good intentions. Every penny of that money has been deposited into a separate account, I continued. I've been tracking it, saving it, documenting it, because I knew that eventually I'd need to return it with interest. I handed Rebecca a check that she placed on the table. That's $4,200, your $3,800 plus 6% interest. I'm returning every cent you gave me because I never needed it, and I won't keep money that was given under false pretenses. Sandra stared at the check as if it were a snake. You're paying us back? I'm clearing my conscience, I said. I won't be indebted to people who saw my imaginary poverty as an opportunity for exploitation. The room fell silent again as everyone processed this latest revelation. Then Tommy asked the question that cut to the heart of everything. Grandpa, do you hate us now? I looked at my youngest grandson, this boy who'd been taught to see me as embarrassing and burdensome, and felt my heart break a little more. No, son. I don't hate you. I'm disappointed. I'm hurt. I'm angry at the adults in this room who should have known better. But I don't hate you. What happens now? Jake asked. Do we still see you? It was the question I'd been dreading because the answer was complicated. That depends, I said, looking directly at Sandra and Marcus, on whether this family can learn from this experience or whether the damage is too deep to repair. Sandra's composure finally cracked completely. Frank, please. We made mistakes, but we're family. We can fix this. We can go back to how things were. How things were was a lie, I replied. You caring about me only when you thought I needed your charity was a lie. Your concern for my well-being being secondary to your desire for my assets was a lie. Your respect for my autonomy and dignity was a lie. I sat back down and looked at each of them in turn. If we're going to have any relationship going forward, it has to be built on truth. Complete, uncomfortable, painful truth. Marcus wiped his eyes and tried to compose himself. What kind of truth? The truth about why you really wanted guardianship. The truth about your financial situation and how my imaginary estate figured into your plans. The truth about whether you can love and respect me as an independent person rather than a resource to be managed. Rebecca interjected gently. Mr. Morrison, would you like to discuss your estate planning? I nodded. Since we're being honest about everything else, let's talk about inheritance. The word made everyone sit up straighter. My original will left everything to Marcus, with provisions for the boy's education and Sandra's security. Standard family inheritance. Sandra's eyes lit up for the first time since the meeting began. However, I continued, watching her expression change, given what I've learned about your true feelings toward me, I've been reconsidering that arrangement. Dad, no, Marcus pleaded. Please don't punish our children for our mistakes. I'm not punishing anyone, I said calmly. I'm making informed decisions about my legacy based on character and behavior rather than blood relations. I gestured to Rebecca, who placed the new will on the table. 80% of my estate now goes to charities focused on elder care and protection from financial abuse. 20% is held in trust for Jake and Tommy's education, accessible only when they turn 25 and demonstrate that they understand the difference between earning money and inheriting it. The silence was deafening. What about us? Sandra whispered. What about you? I asked. You've spent 2 years planning to put me in a nursing home and liquidate my assets. You've documented my supposed mental decline to support guardianship proceedings. You've treated me like a problem to be managed rather than a person to be respected. Why would you expect to benefit from that behavior? Marcus looked like he might collapse. Dad, please. We can change. We can do better. Can you? I asked. Because here's what I've learned about both of you. When you thought I had nothing, you saw me as a burden. When you thought I had a little, you saw me as someone to manage. Now that you know I have a lot, you see me as someone to appease. But when have you ever just seen me as Frank? As your father? As a person worthy of respect regardless of my bank account? Tommy raised his hand like he was in school. Grandpa? Can I say something? Of course, son. I think I did see you differently when I thought you were poor, and that makes me a bad person, doesn't it? The honesty in his young voice nearly broke me. Tommy, recognizing that makes you a person who can grow and change. The question is whether you want to. He nodded solemnly. I do want to change. I want to love you because you're my grandpa, not because of money or anything else. And you, Jake? My older grandson looked uncomfortable but met my eyes. I'm embarrassed, Grandpa. I was embarrassed of you, and that was wrong. I want to do better, too. I felt the first glimmer of hope since this confrontation began. The boys, at least, seemed capable of genuine self-reflection. Sandra, Marcus, the same question applies to you. Marcus nodded immediately. Yes, Dad. I want to rebuild our relationship on the right foundation. I want to earn back your trust and respect." Sandra was quiet for a long moment, and I could practically see the wheels turning in her head. Finally, she spoke. "Frank, I'll be honest. This is a lot to process. Finding out you've been testing us for 2 years. Finding out you've been recording our private conversations. Finding out you manipulated us into revealing our worst impulses. It feels like betrayal, too. At least she was being direct. But," she continued, "I also understand that our behavior was wrong. I can see how it looked from your perspective, and I want to work toward forgiveness and better relationships. It was a politician's answer, acknowledging fault without accepting full responsibility." Rebecca checked her watch. "Mr. Morrison, we should discuss the practical implications of today's revelations." "Such as?" "Well, first, you'll need to decide how you want to handle your living situation going forward. Do you want to continue the modest lifestyle, or are you ready to live openly as a wealthy man?" I'd been thinking about this question for weeks. I think the experiment has run its course. I'm 70 years old, and I'm tired of pretending to be poor. It's time I started enjoying the money Margaret and I worked so hard to accumulate. "What does that mean, practically?" Marcus asked. "It means I'll be moving to a penthouse apartment I own downtown. It means I'll be driving the Mercedes that's been sitting in a garage for 2 years. It means I'll be traveling, dining well, and living the life of a wealthy retiree." Sandra perked up slightly. "Does that mean we'll see more of you?" "That depends entirely on your behavior going forward," I said. "If you can demonstrate genuine respect for me as a person, not as a source of potential inheritance, then yes, we can rebuild our relationship." "What would that look like?" Jake asked. "It would look like visits that aren't assessments of my mental capacity, conversations that don't revolve around my finances or living arrangements, respect for my autonomy and my right to make my own decisions about my money and my life." I stood up and walked back to the window, looking out at the life I was about to leave behind. "Most importantly, it would mean accepting that my wealth is mine to do with as I please. If you can love and respect me without expectation of financial benefit, then we have a foundation to build on." Tommy raised his hand again. "Grandpa, can we start over? Like, pretend the last 2 years didn't happen and just try to have a normal family relationship?" I smiled at him, the first genuine smile of this entire difficult afternoon. "We can't pretend it didn't happen, son. But we can learn from it and do better going forward." Rebecca began packing up her papers. "Mr. Morrison, shall I prepare the documentation for your change in living circumstances?" "Yes, please. And, Rebecca, I want you to establish a family education fund." "What kind of fund?" I turned back to face my family. "A fund that will pay for family counseling sessions for anyone in this room who wants to participate. Professional help to rebuild trust and communication." Marcus looked up hopefully. "You'd do that?" "I'd invest in that," I corrected. "Whether it pays off depends entirely on your commitment to the process." Sandra was studying me with an expression I couldn't quite read. "Frank, can I ask you something directly?" "Of course." "Are you ever going to be able to forgive us? Really forgive us, not just tolerate us for the boys' sake?" It was a surprisingly insightful question, and it deserved an honest answer. "Sandra, forgiveness isn't a switch I can flip. It's a process. It depends on your actions going forward, your willingness to acknowledge the harm you've caused, and your commitment to building a relationship based on respect rather than expectation." I looked around the room at each member of my family. "What I learned over the past 2 years is that you were all capable of treating me badly when you thought I was vulnerable. The question now is whether you're capable of treating me well when you know I'm not." David Chen gathered his property documents and prepared to leave. "Mr. Morrison, I'll have your new apartment ready by Monday. Do you need help with the transition?" "I think I can manage," I said with a slight smile. "After all, I've been managing quite well for 70 years. After David and Rebecca left, my family and I sat in my modest living room for the last time, surrounded by the props of a deception that had revealed more truth than any of us had been prepared to face. "So," I said finally, "the question now is simple. Do we move forward as a family committed to honesty and respect, or do we acknowledge that the damage is too deep to repair?" The answer to that question would determine not just my relationship with my son and daughter-in-law, but the legacy I'd leave my grandsons, a legacy that had nothing to do with money and everything to do with character. Tommy looked around the room and then directly at me. "Grandpa, I vote for moving forward, but I want to do it right this time." Jake nodded agreement. "Me too." Marcus and Sandra exchanged a look before Marcus answered. "Dad, if you're willing to give us another chance, we'd like to take it." I studied their faces, looking for sincerity beneath the obvious relief at not being completely cut off from a significant inheritance. "All right then," I said finally. "We'll try. But this time, we do it on my terms. Honest communication, mutual respect, and the understanding that my money is not your retirement plan." As they prepared to leave my apartment for the last time, I had one final surprise for them. "Oh, and one more thing," I said, reaching into the drawer of my end table. "I have something that belongs to you." I handed Tommy a small wrapped package. "Your Christmas present from 2 years ago. The one I returned because you said you didn't want anything from your smelly poor grandpa." Tommy unwrapped it to reveal a vintage baseball card, a 1952 Mickey Mantle rookie card worth more than most people's cars. His eyes went wide. "Grandpa, this is worth—" "More than you know," I finished. "I bought it because I remembered you loved baseball when you were little, before you decided you were too cool to spend time with me." Tommy clutched the card to his chest. "I'm sorry, Grandpa. I'm really, really sorry." "I know you are, son. The question is what you're going to do with that sorry." As my family filed out of my apartment, each of them looked back one last time at the modest surroundings that had hidden a wealthy man's greatest experiment in human nature. On Monday, I would move into my penthouse and begin living openly as a millionaire. But today's revelations had been about more than money. They'd been about respect, dignity, and the price of taking family for granted. Whether we could rebuild our relationships remained to be seen. But at least now we'd be building on a foundation of truth rather than deception. And sometimes that's the best any family can hope for.